Well, we're halfway through. It's essentially this time of building anticipation. It's re-experiencing that sense of waiting for Jesus's birth, his arrival that is marked by Christmas. But in doing so, in re-experiencing this anticipation of Christmas, we're also recognizing that his coming is not some ancient thing that we're just waiting for, and we're trying to reconnect to it. He's actively coming to his people today. He's coming on a personal level. And at a greater level, we continue also to anticipate when he's going to come in his fullness in the future. Give me a second. My beard likes to get in the way of this microphone. It's connected to this this anticipation that we're reminded of why we use the color blue for Advent. It's this early morning sky color of anticipation. It's when the sky turns blue, but the sun hasn't come over the horizon yet. And so blue is this color of anticipation. And it's what I hope begins to happen as we look at these colors is that we begin to see these in nature around us. And it can bring God to mind. A few weeks ago, green was the color of ordinary time. And we had green behind us. Green's the color of life. It's the color of something new. And over time, as we associate green with ordinary time, with the church, with God's life, as we build this tie in our mind, it can develop something in us that when springtime comes around and we start to see things getting green, we just have one more connection that we're like, green. I remember green. We go through green season every year. It's the life of God. And the color blue now is this pre-sunrise sky. And for those of us who are so wired to get up early in the morning, or forced to get up early in the morning, if you're up before sunrise and you get to see just that blue sky before the sun gets here, it can stir us to again think of that anticipation that the first Christians were sitting there waiting on, not even knowing they were going to become Christians, but they're waiting for the Messiah. And it reminds us of the anticipation time that we still sit in now, waiting for Jesus to come back. So it's cool. We get these subtle exposures to colors that begin to be cues to our mind, just giving us another chance to reflect on God, giving us another chance through our day to see something that says, oh, I know that color. I know what that color means to me. A special note today was that we have the pink. What the church says is actually the rose. It's a rose-colored candle. Rose is the color of joy. And so again, we're associating another color with the joy of God. And it's this chance to see in the colors of our creation memories of who God is to us, where we are as humans before him. And it can stir our mind in those areas. So joy is the topic of today. And we read this amazing passage in Isaiah 35. It's this passage time where Isaiah, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, Isaiah is writing to a bewildered people. Our nation is divided. We are seeing it be destroyed. We are being enslaved. And they're wondering, is the dream all over? And Isaiah says, no, the dream isn't over. Great things will come. There is a time of joy ahead. And that's where the chapter carries us. Isaiah is looking in chapter 35 at the poor state of God's people as they're destroyed and overwhelmed. And he contrasted it in chapter 34 with Edom. It was a nation who was understood to be God's enemies, the enemy of God's people. And in chapter 34, he remarks about how they're prospering. And so the situation that Isaiah is reporting on is, man, the enemy of God's people are doing so well. And here we are, destroyed, suffering. What do we do with this? And Isaiah says what I believe most prophets are called to do. He brings a message of hope and joy and understand that there's something coming. God is faithful and he will see this through. And he says this isn't how it's going to remain. God will set his people back on their feet and fortunes will be reversed. And God's people will find joy. And this joy will never end this time. Now we need to be careful how literal we take the details that Isaiah gives us. Prophecy tends to be contextual in the manner that it takes timeless truths and wants to impart them, but it puts the words into immediate language that the immediate audience can understand. For example, in Isaiah 35, the process of transitioning to joy, as Isaiah describes it, is that the jackals and lions will be gone. Well, thank God. I'm tired of jackals and lions being in my parking lot at church. This doesn't really carry forward to us, the language. But this is how someone in Isaiah's day would recognize the road to joy. Man, I would be so glad. I would rejoice if I didn't have to worry about jackals destroying my livestock. If I didn't have to worry about lions being around when my little toddler's trying to play outside. This would be joyful. So the ancient audience can see this as joy. There's not wild animals everywhere. And we don't necessarily understand, we can't identify with that readily because we don't have a lion in our parking lot right now. But what we can see is that the words of the prophet, they're timely to their setting, but there's a truth behind them that's meant to be timeless. With this in mind, I'd like to explore the prophecy of joy from Isaiah and see how it can apply to our Advent. Applying to our Advent, particularly as Luke also presents the Advent. These are the marks that we find in Isaiah's prophecy. First, the message of Isaiah is prefaced against the fear or panic of those who are about to receive a message of joy. There's little details in Scripture that intricately connect things hundreds of years apart. And the audience of Isaiah is told, don't fear, don't panic, don't be terrified, because this message is going to be encouraging. It's good news that there will be joy ahead. Likewise, in a little detail in Luke, in chapter 2, we read this passage last week, we find a message prefaced against the fear or panic of the shepherds. An angel appears and they're terrified. And the angel says, don't fear. Why? Just like Isaiah says, because you're getting a message of joy. This isn't meant to be fearful. This isn't meant to be something to be terrified of. And so it's a little detail about how each message is prefaced by the absence or the call to abstain from fear. Know that there's joy here in what I'm about to tell you. The second point in Isaiah's message is that it's good news of deliverance. Specifically, Isaiah says, look, your God comes to avenge. With divine retribution, he comes to deliver you. Amen. Get him. That's what I want, right? We want some retribution and some vengeance. Let's do it, God. That's what we want. That's the deliverance that I want. Man, those people that oppress me in my life, holy knockout time. This will bring me joy, right? Seeing vengeance and retribution carried against those who I don't like. Right? But these people messed up. They picked on God's people. They picked on God's favorite kid right here. And they're about to get theirs. It's going to make me feel good to see God break some heads. But this isn't what we find vengeance and retribution mean. Vengeance and retribution is not against a human being. And this brings us to the third mark of Isaiah's prophecy. This vengeance and retribution that's going to lead to deliverance. It's not against human powers. Against the ones that I feel have wronged me and I want God to take them out. And we know this because God's vengeance and retribution doesn't result in political freedom. It doesn't result in the crushing of armies, so God puts his people on the top of the worldly power scheme. Rather, we see the result of God's vengeance and retribution is in Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 and 6. It says, "Then blind eyes will open, deaf ears will hear. Then the lame will leap like deer. The mute tongue will shout for joy." Remember, the prophecy doesn't have to be read literally. This is not just a prophecy literally about blindness and deafness and lameness and being mute. And if you have any other issues, sorry, this message isn't for you. This message isn't literal like that. That's not how prophecy works. These afflictions are ones that reflected a greater picture of a broken world. We as humans have learned through science how to overcome each of these issues to a degree. We've developed Braille to make life easier, to alleviate some of the issues with blindness. We've created cochlear implants to fix deafness at times. We've designed all kinds of surgeries, braces, and accessibility features for those who are lame. My wife Liz and I were just down in Bend recently, and we went to this building where there was a paralyzed guy in a powered bodysuit learning how to walk in this thing, learning how to keep his balance. And for the mute, we've come up with sign language to communicate, and we even have technology now where they can communicate on a computer, but just by moving their eyes. So do we think that because human ingenuity will one day seemingly conquer these issues, that these afflictions Isaiah talks about, do we think that because we may conquer them, we don't need Isaiah's message? No, it's because these specific afflictions, they're not really the point. It's the brokenness of creation that's behind these issues. This is what the prophecy has in mind. After all, what good does it do to address the surface issues that we can see if we don't actually get to the root issue? Amy touched on this last week when she talked about Jesus healing the paralytic and dealing with his sins. Think you're going to do that? Who are you to deal with sins? Well, I'll also tell him to walk. But I dealt with the root. I dealt with the issue of his soul. And the vengeance and the retribution and the deliverance that Isaiah has here is against and from and out of the forces of death that break creation and prevent it from operating as it was meant to operate. It's the evil that has ruined our senses like sight and hearing It's the evil that keeps us from being capable human beings and serving God in the fullness we were designed to serve him in. The vengeance, the retribution, and deliverance is against all the forces that oppose all of humanity. It's not against the key humans that I want to see God go over and smack them around a little bit. I have to remember that Paul says that our war is not against any other human. These other humans are just as broken and enslaved as we are. And it's because of this that Jesus could pray for freedom for those who were literally killing him, pounding nails through his hands, through his feet. And Jesus says, Father, forgive them. Jesus understood my war is not with you. Political freedom may come one day when God comes and sets everything right. But what we see in Isaiah is that this is not the explicit target. The people are wondering when freedom will come from Assyrians and Babylonians and all this oppression they've experienced, and even Edom, who is afflicting them as well. And God's saying, I'm going to bring you vengeance. I'm going to bring you deliverance. And they're like, yeah, go get those Assyrians. And God says, I'm going to go get blindness. I'm going to get lameness. This isn't the idea that Israel had in mind, but this is God going to the root of the problem on behalf of everyone. On these second and third marks of Isaiah, on the issue of the vengeance and deliverance and the lameness and blindness, of delivering and its application for humanity against our real enemies, which is not each other. On these two marks of Isaiah's prophecy, Luke records in chapter 2 that the angels tell the shepherd they've brought good news of deliverance, the birth of a Savior, which will bring joy not to the Israelites against the Assyrians and Babylonians, but it will bring joy to all people. Isaiah's message and Luke's message are ones for all of humanity. Later in Luke 4, Jesus reads from another prophecy of Isaiah that speaks of vindication and deliverance. And Jesus says that before the eyes of his direct audience, this time has come. Here is the time. And the proof will come as Jesus then goes out and heals the lame and the blind. He's dealing with the surface issues that even Isaiah referenced, that reflect back to those root issues that we deal with, that is opposing all of humanity. And Isaiah records that as people are delivered, they are then invited onto this path or way, which is enveloped in life and safety. The jackals are gone, the lions are gone, all the wild animals are gone. And Isaiah says this greenery comes up. The place is now fertile land. It's watered. There's water now. And through this fertile land, through this new life land, there's a pathway that goes through it. And that's our pathway to permanent joy. Luke will record later in the book of Acts that Christianity is called the way. We've gone to this path. These details are there. And what we see in this brief skimming of the material is that the anticipation time we're identifying with, a time that preceded the birth of Jesus, but then also a time where we realize our own deliverance as we connect with God. We're on this path that Isaiah and Luke spoke of. But we're not to this full experience of Zion where joy exists without interruption. So we've realized what was anticipation. As Jesus came forward from this future age to break into our lives today. Jesus came at his birth to carry forward to us from the future. A time where God sets everything right. A time where all is right. And Jesus comes to us from there. He comes forward to us to meet us and break into this old age that we're in that's broken. And he breaks into it with this new age reality. Things are defeated. Things are changed. But we simultaneously haven't yet fully realized it yet. And we're still found within this timeline of the old age and its dynamics that make us suffer, that have all kinds of issues. I think of as I was getting ready to leave Iraq, my first tour in Iraq. We'd been out on what's called a forward operating base. It's a small base that rudimentary supplies are there. It's not big and glorious like a big army base that the big army bases, you got amazing cooks, you got all kinds of great stuff at the big army base. In fact, after I left Afghanistan, the big army base ended up with a Pizza Hut, a Burger King, all kinds of stuff in Afghanistan. In Iraq, we'd go into downtown Baghdad to the army base. There was a Burger King there. Couldn't wait to get a Whopper. But then we'd leave and go back out to our forward operating base where minimal comfort. So we're in this forward operating base. Things are a little rough living, but we're making it through. Over the time that we were there, we lost a few soldiers. Some of you heard some of my stories about that. But they say it's time to go home. Awesome. Can't wait to get home. We turn in our weapons. We turn in our ammunition. They fly us to the big Air Force base so we can wait to fly home. The joy is right there. And the joy is ahead of us. We can't wait to land in America. We know that when we get to America, we've forgotten all the bad, right? We just think, oh man, can't wait to get to America. That's where we'll find our unending joy again after we've been over here in this third world country. So for us, that's where great joy exists. And it's broken into where we are in Iraq because we've been told we're going to be there. We have our orders in hand. These are your orders to go home. Great. It's a reality that's going to happen. I'm feeling it a little bit, but it hasn't quite happened yet. And as we're sitting there in Al-Assad in Iraq, an offensive is launched by the insurgents. Suddenly our plans are canceled. Our flight home is put on hold because they can't fly any planes out because the insurgents are shooting at everything. As we're sitting there in that in-between moment, we know where we're supposed to be going. We've been given the orders to get there. We still fall under attack. In the cusp of getting there, as we're sitting in Iraq, we would lose a couple more soldiers just on that base. That's how I picture the reality we are now. We have orders. We have orders to where we're going. And because we know where we're going, because we know what's there, and that reality has begun to come into our lives now, we feel it, we experience it, but not in its fullness. And we're still in that in-between state where we're not in that perfect place. I believe I mentioned in the past, there's theologians like N.T. Wright who calls this dynamic the now, but not yet. I'd already turned in my guns. I'd already turned in my ammo. My mind, I had short timers. My mind and heart were as good as in America already. That's where we are here too, is we're in this now, but not yet. We know where we're going. We know where our heart is. We know where our mind is focused. And so we're there somewhat, but we're also not yet there. To return to the color blue and the pre-dawn sky. It's in this middle period where the sun is breaking into our day, but it has not yet become fully present at the same time. That's where we are now. We've been glancing at Mark through this series to balance out our Advent time. Because while the literal advent of Jesus' birth is omitted from Mark's gospel, we can find the themes of Advent brought to maturity in the Gospel of Mark. In this case, Mark records the fulfillment of Isaiah's message of deliverance to a T. In Mark, Jesus addresses the blind, the deaf, the lame, the mute, representing Jesus' greater deliverance against the forces of a broken world. Jesus is here working to operate on behalf of all humanity. At the same time, the theme of joy is noticeably absent from the Gospel of Mark. In this, I'm grateful for the humanity of Mark's gospel. Despite having the joy of Isaiah's promise, the joy of Jesus' arrival, and the joy of an anticipated happy ending, all the signs are there. All the evidences that should lend themselves to me feeling joy. In my experience now with the suffering in our world, sometimes I simply cannot feel that joy. Sometimes I simply cannot talk about that joy. Sometimes I can't even bear to hear about that joy. And in these Advent themes and in the holiday times, where joy and being joyful is shoved into my face from every angle, if I didn't have the Gospel of Mark to balance things out, I might think something was seriously wrong with me. My faith is broken. At times, I cannot find this joy you say I should have, especially in this season. I can't work it up. I can't experience it. I can't even speak of it. Can't even stand for others to be like, where's your joy? Let's get the joy, and I can't get there sometimes. But what the Gospel of Mark lets me know, and lets the rest of us know, is it's okay if you don't feel joy. Mark could talk about all this amazing good stuff, including the signs that were happening from Isaiah 35. But Mark couldn't actually speak to joy in his message. He wrote to a suffering audience. I referenced this a couple weeks ago. He wrote to a suffering audience who was undergoing pretty much the same thing they were undergoing when Isaiah wrote. And he could give them all the left brain stuff. This is how the Messiah all makes sense. This is what he's doing. Here's all the facts of the case. But the emotion of joy was missing in the middle of this suffering reality that Mark was writing to. In fact, the only mention of joy in the Gospel of Mark has to do with the one who joyfully receives the gospel. And then it dies out. Mark is a dark gospel. And his good news is strangely absent in calling out joy. And I like it. Probably for the same reason that I like the book of Job as my favorite book in the Bible, for its connection to what it means to be human. We just sang a song that says, I'll always sing of your goodness. But that's not the reality we live in. And what can be dangerous is when we get into hyperbole of Scripture. In one psalm, David will say, I will always speak of your goodness. And the next psalm, David will say, why do you let the evil prosper? What's wrong with you? They have to balance each other out. I have my days where I wake up. I experience such joy. I will always have this joy. And then I read a tweet like the one that I told you about. Here's a woman just before Christmas. Husband has a stroke and son's fighting cancer. And I go, how can I have joy when I see this in the world? Mark assures me that if one of the 4 gospel messages can present good news, but still be pessimistic and dark, and struggle with finding and communicating joy, if one of our 4 gospels can have that struggle, it's okay for me to have that struggle. Mark gives me permission to be human and not a joy robot. I've heard from people about the guilt or embarrassment that they may feel when they simply cannot find joy in the Christmas season. In fact, some feel guilty because the season of joy for so many is actually a repeat season for them of sadness and depression. Why can't I get over this? What is wrong with me? Signs of joy everywhere. What Mark lets us know is that's okay. It's okay to be human. You can have the gospel, and you don't have to always speak to joy. Mark has the gospel. He shares it in an entire book. And the one time he speaks of joy is a pessimistic. Yeah, if you're joyful about the gospel, you might just walk away later. So Mark balances out our message. Mark balances out that pressure to feel joy and opens it up to it's okay to be human. I want to call Nate up. I want to close today with this. Joy has invaded our world. The signs of Isaiah's prophecy promising joy has come to this world through Jesus. We anticipate celebrating again this year as we come to Christmas. We anticipate celebrating the birth of Jesus. That is not vengeance and destruction on my human enemies, but it's joy for all humanity. And we look forward to a time of permanent joy. But if in the middle of this season or at any other time in your life you cannot feel joy, it's okay. You are okay. You are loved. Your ability to approach God and know Him does not hinge on your ability to find joy all the time. All it hinges on is your humanness. So as we close today, I invite you in this last song of worship, not to try to fight for joy if you can't find it right now, but to simply come to God as you are. A human being who will sometimes have joy right now and sometimes won't. But having the assurance that God always has joy in you, in each of you, God has joy for each of you. And God would love to embrace each of you no matter where you find yourself. So let's turn our attention to the God who has joy in us, even when we struggle to find joy. Let's turn our attention to him in this last song of worship.